Chronology. 1821, 30th October, born Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoyevsky in Moscow, the son of Mikhail Andreevich, head physician at Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor, and of Maria Fyodorovna, daughter of a merchant family. 1823, Pushkin begins Eugene Onegin. 1825, death of Tsar Alexander I and accession of Nicholas I, followed by the revolt of several thousand officers and soldiers in Saint Petersburg, the Decembrist uprising. 1831, Mikhail Andreevich, having risen to the status of nobleman, buys a small estate south of Moscow at Darovo, where his wife and children now spend their summers. During this year, he also takes his wife and elder sons to see Schiller's play The Robbers, which makes a great impression on the young Dostoevsky. Pushkin finishes Eugene Onegin. 1834, enrolled with his elder brother Mikhail, born 1820, at Chermak's, Moscow's leading boarding school. 1837, Pushkin killed in a duel. Maria Fyodorovna dies, and the brothers are sent to preparatory school in Saint Petersburg. 1838, enters the Saint Petersburg Academy of Military Engineers. Mikhail is not admitted. 1839, father dies, apparently murdered by serfs on his estate. 1840, publication of Lermontov's A Hero of Our Time. 1841, obtains a commission, works on two historical plays, Mary Stuart and Boris Godunov, both lost. 1842, promoted to second lieutenant, publication of Gogol's Dead Souls and The Overcoat. 1843, graduates from the Academy, attached to St. Petersburg Army Engineers Corps. 1844, resigns his commission, publication of his translation of Balzac's Eugénie Grandet, also translates George Sand's La Dernière Aldini, only to find that another translation has already appeared. Works on Poor Folk, his first novel. 1845, establishes a friendship with Russia's most prominent and influential literary critic, Vissarion Belinsky, who praises Poor Folk and acclaims its author as Gogol's successor. 1846, Poor Folk and The Double published. While Poor Folk is widely praised, The Double is much less successful. Mr. Prokharchin also published. 1846-47, nervous ailments and the onset of epileptic seizures. Begins regular consultations with Dr. Stepan Yanovsky. Utopian socialist and atheist M.V. Butashevich Petrashevsky becomes an acquaintance, begins attending the Petrashevsky Circle. A novel in 9 letters and The Landlady are published. 1848, several short stories published, including White Nights, A Weak Heart, A Christmas Party and a Wedding, and An Honest Thief. 1849, first installments of Natoshka Nezvanova published. Arrested along with other members of the Petrashevsky Circle, convicted of political offenses against the Russian state, sentenced to death, taken out to Semyonovsky Square to be shot by firing squad, but reprieved moments before execution. Instead, sentenced to an indefinite period of exile in Siberia, to begin with 8 years of penal servitude, later reduced to 4 years by Tsar Nicholas I. 1850, prison and hard labor in Omsk, Western Siberia. 1853, outbreak of Crimean War. 1854, released from prison and sent to serve in an infantry battalion at Semipalatinsk, southwestern Siberia. Allowed to live in private quarters. Becomes a regular visitor at the home of Alexander Isiev, an alcoholic civil servant, and his wife Maria Dmitrieva Isieva. Promoted to non-commissioned officer. 1855, Alexander II succeeds Nicholas I, some relaxation of state censorship. 1857. Marries the widowed Maria Isayeva after a long courtship, and soon after has a major seizure which leads to the first official confirmation of his epilepsy. Publication of The Little Hero, written in prison during the summer of 1849. 1858. Petitions Alexander II to be released from military service on medical grounds. Works on The Village of Stepanchikova and Its Inhabitants and Uncle's Dream. 1859. Allowed to return to live in European Russia, and in December returns with his wife and stepson Pavel to Saint Petersburg. First chapters of The Village of Stepanchikova and Its Inhabitants and Uncle's Dream published. 1861. Emancipation of the Serfs. Launch of Time, Vremya, a monthly journal of literature and socio-political affairs edited by Dostoyevsky and his elder brother Mikhail. In the first issues he publishes his first full-length novel, The Insulted and the Injured, and the first part of Notes from the Dead House, based on his experience in Omsk. 1862. Second part of Notes from the Dead House and A Nasty Tale published in Time. Makes first trip abroad, to Europe, visiting Germany, France, England, Switzerland, Italy. Gambles in Wiesbaden. Meets Alexander Herzen in London. Turgenev's Fathers and Sons. 1863. Winter Notes on Summer Impressions based on his European travels, published in Time. Liaison with Apollinaria Suslova begins at about this time. After Maria Dmitrieva is taken seriously ill, he travels abroad again, gambles and visits Italy with Suslova. Publication of Nikolai Cherneshsky's novel What is to be Done. 1864. In March launches with Mikhail the journal Epocha, as a successor to Time, now banned by the Russian authorities. Notes from the Underground published in Epocha. In April, death of Maria Dmitrieva. In July, death of Mikhail. The International Workingmen's Association, the first international, founded in London. 1865. Epoch ceases publication owing to lack of funds. Courts Anna Korvin-Krukovskaya, a contributor to Epoch and future revolutionary activist. She turns down his proposal of marriage. To meet his debts, signs very unfavorable contract with the publisher Stelovsky. Gambles in Wiesbaden. Works on crime and punishment. First fragment of Tolstoy's War and Peace. 1866. Dmitry Karakosov attempts to assassinate Alexander II. Interrupts writing of Crime and Punishment to write The Gambler, promised to Stelovsky by 1st November. Hires a young stenographer, Anna Grigorievna Snitkina, who helps him complete the novel in 26 days. The Gambler published in December. Crime and Punishment serialized in 8 issues of The Russian Messenger, Ruski Vestnik. 1867. Marries Anna. Hounded by creditors, they leave for Western Europe, where they will spend the next 4 years. 1868. Birth of daughter Sophia, who dies at 3 months. The Idiot, published in serial form in The Russian Messenger. 1869. Birth of daughter Lyubov in Dresden. The Nechayev Affair. Ivan Ivanov is murdered by fellow members of a clandestine revolutionary cell led by Sergei Nechayev. 1870. Starts work on Demons. V.I. Ulyanov, later known as Lenin, is born in the town of Simbirsk on the banks of the Volga. The Eternal Husband published. 1871. Moves back to Saint Petersburg with his wife and family. Birth of son Fyodor. 1871-2. Serial publication of Demons. 1873. becomes contributing editor of conservative weekly journal Citizen, Grazdanin, where his A Writer's Diary is published as a regular column. Bobok published. 1875. The Adolescent published. Birth of son Alexei. 1876. The Meek One published in A Writer's Diary. 1877. The Dream of a Ridiculous Man published in A Writer's Diary. 1878. Death of son Alexei after an epileptic fit. Works on the Brothers Karamazov. 1879. Yosef Vissarionovich Djugashvili, later known as Stalin, born in Gori, Georgia. First part of The Brothers Karamazov published. 1880. The Brothers Karamazov published in complete form. Speech in Moscow at the unveiling of a monument to Pushkin is greeted with wild enthusiasm. 1881. Dostoyevsky dies in Saint Petersburg after repeated pulmonary hemorrhage, January 28th. Buried in the cemetery of the Alexander Nevsky Monastery. The funeral procession from the author's apartment numbers over 30,000. Assassination of Alexander II, March 1st. Introduction. A ready-made title, Crime and Punishment, suggests a ready-made plot. A man will commit a crime. He will be caught. He will be punished. His fate will revolve around the conflicts between freedom and conscience, the delinquent individual and the punitive state. Justice, no doubt, will be done. In January 1866, when the first installment of Crime and Punishment appeared in The Russian Messenger, Ruski Vestnik, prospective readers might have indulged in further well-reasoned speculation. Here was a title steeped in the ferment of its time, an era marked on the one hand by the ambitious reforms of Tsar Alexander II, 1818 to 1881, not least to the entire judicial process, and on the other by mounting radicalism and nascent terrorism, prompted in large part by the perceived failure of these same reforms. Serfdom may have been consigned to history 5 years earlier, but the harsh terms of the serfs' emancipation had done little to alleviate social injustice. Would this then be a novel of political rebellion? Or perhaps, given the increasingly conservative leanings of the aging Dostoevsky and of Mikhail Kutkoff, editor of The Russian Messenger, a satire of these revolutionary tendencies? Inevitably, the novel would also be rooted in the bitter experience of its famous author. After all, he too, in his free-thinking youth, had known crime and punishment at first hand. His chief crime was to read out more than once Vissarion Belinsky's letter to Nikolai Gogol, 1809 to 1852, in which Russia's leading critic railed against Russia's leading author, whose latest book had revealed him to be a proponent of the knout, of church, state, and serfdom. Dostoevsky's punishment, and that of a disparate group of his associates, broadly linked by utopian socialist sympathies, was to face the firing squad on St. Petersburg's Semyonovsky Square in December 1849. The sentence was commuted by Tsar Nicholas I, 1796 to 1855, in the most theatrical manner. Finally, Crime and Punishment would be imbued with ideas familiar to all readers of Dostoevsky's post-Siberian journalism. Educated Russia needed to return to its roots, to the soil, to the people. Only thus could the warring tribes of westernizers and Slavophiles, elites and commoners be joined. Only thus would the country's ancient wounds be healed. At one level, the novel we go on to read satisfies all of these conventional expectations. At another, all of them are unsettled, if not thoroughly undermined. We read of murders committed by a handsome young man whom it would be difficult to identify precisely with the radicals of the 1860s, though some offended young readers contrived to do so, or with its unhandsome author. Disturbingly, this man is unsure that his gruesome acts were crimes at all, unsure at times that they even happened. For much of the book, he even seems to forget one of his murders entirely. The reality of punishment eludes him for an unreasonably long time, despite his best efforts. In his mind, everything begins to merge: past and future, right and wrong, perpetrator and victim, crime and punishment. The opposition stated by the title, so familiar and in its way so comforting, begins to dissolve for the reader too. A dark joke, perhaps, like Dostoevsky's own Execution, yet no less serious for that. Because it was written before The Idiot, 1868, Demons, 1871-2, and The Brothers Karamazov, 1879-80, and because it is so often described as a version of the murder mystery or as a novel of religious conversion, Crime and Punishment has an entrenched reputation as the most straightforward of Dostoevsky's great quartet of late novels. Yet its puzzles and ambiguities, when fully entered into, allowed the reader to share the same vertiginous confusion experienced by its protagonist, Rodion Raskolnikov. In the words of Williona Virginia Woolf, "Against our wills, we are drawn in, whirled around, blinded, suffocated, and at the same time filled with a giddy rapture. Out of Shakespeare, there is no more exciting reading." The sources of the novel's complexity can be traced to the opening sentences of the first detailed record we have of Dostoevsky's plans for the book. Originally envisioned as a long story, Crime and Punishment was proposed to Katkov in a letter from Wiesbaden, where the recently widowed 43-year-old Dostoevsky was enduring what his most comprehensive biographer, the late Joseph Frank, aptly calls a period of protracted mortification. His first wife, with whom he had rarely been happy, had succumbed to tuberculosis the previous year. Mikhail, his brother and soulmate, had also died in 1864, leaving enormous debts. This moral and financial destitution was further compounded by Dostoevsky's two uncontrollable manias, one for roulette, another, only marginally weaker, for his ex-mistress Apollinaria Suslova, a femme fatale 18 years his junior. To top it all, he had recently signed a contract with the unscrupulous publisher Fyodor Dostoyevsky, requiring him, on pain of losing all rights to his own works, to complete an additional novel by 1 November 1866. Yet for all this pressure and turmoil, the proposal for a psychological record of a crime which Dostoevsky submitted to Katkov is notable for its clarity, confidence, and precision. It begins. A contemporary setting, this current year, 1865. A young man, excluded from student status at university, of trading class, living in extreme poverty, succumbs through frivolity and ricketiness of thought to certain strange, half-baked ideas in the air, and makes up his mind to get out of his foul situation in a single bound. A great deal changed between the conception of this story in a German spa town and the eventual birth of the novel in Russia. It expanded not only in size, but also in perspective, which grew from the confessional mode, often favored by Dostoevsky in his fiction hitherto, to a third-person viewpoint of virtual omniscience and deliberate naivety, as Dostoevsky himself described it in his notebooks. Very little changed, however, about the two sentences quoted above. They contain in embryo the strange mixture of ingredients that will determine Raskolnikov's half-real, half-theoretical drama: poverty and social exclusion on the one hand, and frivolous, half-baked thoughts on the other. Only one element is missing, the element of psychogeography, as it would now be called. This is memorably supplied by Saint Petersburg, the most premeditated and abstract city in the world, built on a northern swamp by Western architects and Russian serfs. Here, too, we are in the realms of the semi-real and semi-theoretical, of rationalism and delusion, a tradition first developed in the Saint Petersburg texts of Alexander Pushkin (1799 to 1837) and Gogol, and now taken in new directions by their pupil Dostoevsky. As we first see him, cooped up in his garret and barely able to rise from his couch, Raskolnikov exists, or he thinks he exists, only in his own mind. For much of the novel, that will remain the case, a sign of his catastrophic isolation from mankind. Yet at the same time, through a chain of spatial metaphors, Dostoevsky makes us see how deeply his mental disarray is tied to the city that surrounds him. This metaphor is characteristic of the novel's curious artistic achievement. As subtle as the axe that Raskolnikov brings down on the head of his first victim, they are also freighted with the exceptional weight of association that makes us, as readers, share in the protagonist's experience of suffocation from causes both abstract and real. Thus, Raskolnikov's mental state finds its external embodiment in his low-ceilinged, cramped garret. This garret, in turn, is a cupboard, a ship's cabin, a cell, and even as perceived by his mother, a coffin. Raskolnikov's mind also stands in metaphorical relation to the broader topography in which his fate is to be played out, the overcrowded, shabby area of St. Petersburg's Haymarket district, with its narrow, twisting streets, its fetid canal or ditch, and its filthy stairwells, drinking dens, and connecting courtyards, through which tradesmen, girl prostitutes, and criminals hurry and scurry. Only a stone's throw from the imperial majesty of the Neva River and Nevsky Prospect, associated with Pushkin and Gogol respectively, this is the shadow St. Petersburg, airless and coffin-like in the height of summer, that Dostoevsky made his own in both literature and life. In place of the sober military capital evoked by Pushkin in The Bronze Horseman, 1833, with its severe, elegant appearance, its perfection of form, Dostoevsky's Haymarket is drunken and unkempt. Here, Baltic Germans shout atrocious Russian, villagers pour into sub-rent corners, and students and officers spout caricatured versions of Bentham and Mill. This, too, is a prison of sorts, not the prison of Pushkin's military autocracy, nor the bureaucratic nightmare of Gogol, but the false freedom of those torn from their roots, left with nothing but words and borrowed ideas. The opening pages acquaint us with these borrowed ideas in the recurring themes of Raskolnikov's wretched soliloquies: how to overcome his cowardice and indecisiveness, how to utter a new word, to take a new step, above all, how to stop talking and start doing. Before us is a Hamlet without a clearly identifiable cause, a man-child who fears the frivolity of his own thoughts, which he is unable to arrange in satisfactory order. A penchant for self-contradiction lends a rebarbative texture to his ruminations, marked by the frequency of but and still, and tapering off in rows of dots. It is the self-lacerating language familiar from the narrator of Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, 1864, but spoken now from beneath the eaves rather than from beneath the floorboards. The masochism of the mouseman of the underground is replaced by Raskolnikov's satanic pride. This pride, however, is knowingly misplaced. Raskolnikov's thoughts are evidently as stale to him as they would have been to contemporary readers, for whom the anxieties of the ineffectual intellectual had long been familiar from novels set on country estates among gifted young men too weak or too comfortable to address the malign status quo. By 1865, the idle moral torments of the superfluous men of Ivan Goncharov, 1812 to 1891, and Ivan Turgenev, 1818 to 1883, had filtered down to the new breed of déclassé, de-Christianized intellectuals, the most influential of whom, such as the socialist Nikolai Chernyshevsky and the nihilist Dmitry Pisarev, (1840 to 1868), were inspiring a generation of revolutionaries with their heavily ideological fiction and criticism. For both of these men, prison was more than a metaphor. In this context, Raskolnikov's vacillations and ruminations are decidedly old school and not infrequently derivative. Thus, Pisarev, in response to Bazarov, the anti-hero of Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, 1862, had already set out a division between the conformist masses and the select few to whom all is permitted and who may be prevented only by personal taste for murder and robbery. Now, 3 years later, this idea is plagiarized by Raskolnikov. Nor does Dostoevsky want us to ignore from the opening page the belated echoes of the title of Chernyshevsky's hymn to the emancipatory power of rational egoism, the novel What is to be Done, 1863. Later, Raskolnikov will address the same question verbatim to his good angel, Sonia, and she in turn will pose it to him. Raskolnikov's answer will again be an act of plagiarism. We must break what must be broken. An almost direct quote from Pisarev, recycled many years later by Lenin. But Raskolnikov is an unlikely revolutionary. He is too much a loner to be the political conspirator his friend Razumikhin mistakes him for, and he is certainly no leader of men. Perhaps he is just a belated romantic, framing his outdated, somewhat comical delusions in the language of his day? Dostoevsky also introduces in the early chapters a further element latent in his pitch to Katkov, the impatience of his protagonist, who makes up his mind to get out of his foul situation in a single bound. This is brought to the surface by the maid and country girl Nastasia, who, endowed with the intuition that Dostoevsky often reserves for his less educated characters, divines that Raskolnikov is too lazy to work and wants his fortune right now. Unimpressed by eggheads who never do a stroke of work, she nevertheless feels a rough tenderness towards him as a human being, foreshadowing the much deeper feelings and intuition that will be shown by Sonia, who similarly opposes her own unconscious wisdom, Sonia, from Sophia, to the sophistry of Raskolnikov. In the folkloric context that would have constituted Nastasia's own education, Raskolnikov might be cast as Ivan the Fool, who sits on the stove all day and waits for a pretty maiden and a crock of gold to fall into his lap. Raskolnikov, who also hails from the provinces, has himself kept one foot in the cuckoo land of magic tales, as an early jarring reference to King P, Tsar Gorok, associated with bygone happiness, makes plain. But Saint Petersburg, he will find, is no place for childish dreams. Nor is it a place for a player, igrok, to give the literal translation of the Russian word for gambler. For Raskolnikov, like Pushkin's Hermann in The Queen of Spades, 1834, and like Dostoevsky himself, is obsessed with the mirage of a winning formula. And it should be no surprise that the short novel for which Dostoevsky had to break off work on Crime and Punishment bears the title Igrok, the Gambler. Produced to fulfill his contract with Stolovsky, it was dictated to a young stenographer, Anna Grigorievna Snitkina, and completed in less than 4 weeks. But if the Gambler is set in a Wiesbadenesque Roulettenberg, where rich and poor throw caution to the winds, Crime and Punishment is set in St. Petersburg, where numbers are calculated coldly, and old pawnbrokers make sure to take their interest in advance. In such a city, murder, too, must be premeditated and abstract, and Raskolnikov's first crime, however risky, is both those things. He even counts the steps from his room to the home of his victim. But when the crime is actually set in motion, he is barely aware of what he is doing. as if a scrap of his clothing had caught in the wheel of a machine that was now pulling him in. This striking contradiction stands at the heart of the novel's innermost concerns, developed over the 500-odd pages that remain after Raskolnikov's murders. 3. The nature of these deepest concerns, however, is far from obvious. The unusual construction of crime and punishment, which gives so much weight to the aftermath of the crime, 5 parts out of 6, and only an epilogue to the punishment itself, has led many to see the novel as less a whodunit than a whydunit. According to Joseph Frank, Crime and Punishment is focused on the solution of an enigma, the mystery of Raskolnikov's motivation. We may wonder, though, whether this enigma is not itself a decoy planted by this most devious of writers. Certainly there is no shortage of motivating factors. Raskolnikov is desperately poor and desperately proud, unable to countenance his own humiliating situation. Nor can he accept the humiliations endured and imposed by his mother and sister, who send him remittances and sacrifice everything to their priceless Rodia. His intended victim, the withered pawnbroker, is a noxious louse who does nothing but harm. Killing her would yield a net gain for humanity, the utilitarian argument. He dreams of being a good man in the future, a benefactor of humanity, the philanthropic argument. He dreams of being a great man, one of the select few, like Lycurgus, Mohammed, or Napoleon, criminals to a man, whose evil deeds in the present will be forgotten by grateful generations in the future, the heroic argument. All of these motivations are valid, but equally, none of them is. Raskolnikov's initial crime is both over and under-motivated, mere casuistry, as he calls it himself. Not for nothing does he overhear another student telling an officer over tea after a game of billiards not only about the self-same pawnbroker, but about why her murder would be morally justified. The student expounds the logic of such a hypothetical crime persuasively and at great length, but the conversation ends in bathos. Here you are, speaking and speechifying, but tell me, are you going to kill the old woman yourself, or aren't you? Of course not. I'm talking about justice. It's not about me. Well, as I see it, if you don't dare do it yourself, there's no justice to speak of. Let's have another game. This coincidence, brazen in its technical naivete, even by Dostoevsky's standards, unless, of course, Raskolnikov is imagining the entire conversation, serves to make a powerful point just before Raskolnikov finally turns words into deed. A why can always be found for a crime. Much more difficult to explain is the how an intention becomes reality, how theory is enfleshed, how abstract reasoning ends in a sensitive, compassionate man slipping in sticky, warm blood. What state of mind is needed for this to happen? Leo Tolstoy, 1828 to 1910, responded to this quandary in his late essay, Why Do People Stupefy Themselves, 1890, where he sought to explain the state of mental automatism in which Raskolnikov carried out his crime. But Tolstoy, an aggressive teetotaler by this stage in his life, was surely exaggerating when he implies that the glass of beer Raskolnikov consumes at the end of the first chapter silences the voice of conscience. Raskolnikov's utter passivity, which makes him succumb to ideas in the air and to gamble everything on one desperate act, reaches back far further than the glass of beer, deeper even than the question of conscience. Nor can it be reduced to the verdict of insanity, as Raskolnikov himself is aware, even when others are not. This passivity is a state of spiritual death, and it is this that enables the crime. Dostoevsky shows how a man who feels as if he is not alive and not truly capable of affecting reality will affect it for precisely that reason, and with catastrophic results. In his own estranged perception, not only is his sense of his own reality attenuated, so too is his sense of the reality of his fellow human beings. of the boundaries between separate lives. The eerie astonishment that overcomes Raskolnikov throughout his crime is the eeriness of a dead man meeting and muffling life. Where does this state of spiritual death come from, and why is this wretched man-child, Raskolnikov, buried alive in his youth? Here, perhaps, is the true enigma to which Dostoevsky applies himself in Crime and Punishment, both before and after the murders. In so doing, he scatters clues and red herrings to enlighten and confound us. Family pressures, societal pressures, illness, loss of faith, all of these possible explanations are deepened in the course of the novel, but also, at various times, ironized and presented as somehow dishonest. Psychoanalytic, religious, sociological, and other interpretations all have much to offer us, but all are also limited, in the final analysis, by Dostoevsky's strategy of ambivalence in both literature and life. Here was a talented actor who could ask his interrogators what proof they had that he was on the side of the critic and not the author when he read out Belinsky's letter to Gogol, and who infused the words of his fictional characters with an exceptional ambiguity of meaning and intonation, employing humor less to lighten their arguments than to complicate them. The regrettable division of much Dostoevsky scholarship, Soviet and post-Soviet, into secular and religious camps ignores the fact that in his fiction, Dostoevsky always thought in terms of pro and contra, not just in his final masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, with its legendary dramatization of atheism versus orthodoxy, but equally in Crime and Punishment. The vector of Dostoevsky's intentions, to judge from his notebooks, letters, and arguably the final pages of this novel, may have tended towards faith and self-abnegation, but the reality of his artistic achievement is very different. Some will be moved by Sonia's selflessness, forgiveness, and acceptance of God's world, whatever its injustices, but many readers will be even more struck by the defiance shown by another woman, Katerina Ivanovna, a drunkard's widow with 3 children on her hands, consumption, and no money, towards the priest summoned against her will at her dying hour. The fire of self-abnegating faith and the fire of injured pride blaze with equal strength from the first chapter of the novel to the last, sometimes within the same hearts, and there is no guarantee which will burn the reader more fiercely. There is perhaps only one chain of clues whose validity seems beyond question in helping us approach the enigma mentioned above: the determinative role of literature itself in shaping Raskolnikov's plight. Incongruous though it may sound in the context of a novel about murder, such a claim will come as less of a surprise to readers of Dostoevsky's earlier works, which are filled with writers or would-be writers, or of his journalism of the early 1860s with its recurrent concern with the effects of knyzhnost, or bookishness, on Russian society. 4. Though never to my knowledge presented as such, Crime and Punishment is one of the most self-reflexive classics of pre-modernist European literature, continuing and developing a line that stretches from Cervantes's Don Quixote, 1605, to Pushkin's Eugen Onegin, 1823-31. It is a novel about words and texts as much as deeds and life, and it is correspondingly saturated with self-quotation and misquotation. The apparently simple line of Raskolnikov's destiny, crime, then punishment, is interwoven with hints about the complicit and complicating role of literature itself. This self-reflexivity is not just a matter of the belatedness and imitativeness already discussed, the possibility that Raskolnikov, like Pushkin's Onegin, might be a parody of earlier bookish types and ideas, nor can it be fully contained by Mikhail Bakhtin's pioneering analysis of the polyphony of Dostoevsky's fiction, The interpenetration of characters' thoughts and speech with each other's words and consciousness, as constantly exhibited by Raskolnikov's monologues, which are in fact dialogues with the words of others. Rather, it is about the immersion of an entire society in texts and in literary dreams, and the baneful consequences for Raskolnikov in particular. Raskolnikov has blood on his socks and ink on his fingers. He prepares for his crime not only by extensive reading, but also, we later learn, by attempting his first literary debut, a scholarly article with the same theme as the drama in which he plays the starring role. Published without his knowledge, this article is shown to him much later by his proud mother, whereupon, despite the grotesque incongruity with his current situation, he experiences that strange and caustically sweet sensation which every author feels on seeing himself published for the first time, especially at only 23 years of age. Raskolnikov's achievements as an author may be modest, but his readerly habits are unshakable. After committing his murders, he visits a tavern to hunt through a pile of recent newspapers for textual evidence of his crime, which itself evokes dozens of other crimes from Russia and Europe widely reported in the Russian press in the 1860s, and especially in Dostoevsky's own journal, Vremya, Time. The trail of his crime is not only physical, but also, and much more elusively, textual, keeping Dostoevsky scholars busy for many decades to come. Raskolnikov is himself a textual sleuth, an inveterate literary critic. Before and after his crime, he shows an uncommon analytical interest in written communications, which are shared with the reader in their entirety, a 10-page letter from his mother, a much curter missive from his sister's odious suitor. He reads between the lines, thereby encouraging us, as readers, to do the same, and judges character by style, surprising those around him by picking on apparently trivial choices of words and phrase at moments when far weightier issues seem to be at stake. For Raskolnikov, life is a text to be understood, and even at times a text that has already been written. At the novel's end, he imagines what the future has in store for him, and asks himself, so why live? Why? Why am I going there now when I know myself that this is exactly how it will be as it is writ? In his bookishness, as in his other characteristics, Raskolnikov is the type of eccentric who at the deepest level is most exemplary of his society. A paradox Dostoyevsky explicitly formulated in his prologue to his last novel, The Brothers Karamazov. Subtly, insistently, we are encouraged to see that Raskolnikov's addiction to the written word is a symptom of a general, albeit less pathological condition that eddies out from the hero to encompass his family and the country at large. One might not want to make too much of the fact that Raskolnikov's patronymic Romanovich etymologically suggests not just son of Roman, a perfectly common name, but also son of the novel, were it not for Raskolnikov's mother telling us that his father, when he was still alive, twice tried sending work to the journals. First, some poems. I still have the notebook. I'll show it to you one day. Then a whole novella. I begged him to let me copy it out for him, and you should have seen how we prayed for them to be accepted. They weren't. Frustrated literary ambition is a powerful motif in Crime and Punishment, displayed in one form or another by several characters across society, especially Raskolnikov's adversaries in the police and civil service. In particular, the investigator Porfiry Petrovich, who engages Raskolnikov in repeated, chapter-long verbal jousts, is a literary artist and actor manqué, who, like Dostoevsky himself, reveres the comic genius of Gogol, citing liberally from his works. In Porfiry's extraordinary rhetoric, we see the interweaving of literary and legal discourse that was such a feature of the Russian judicial system before and after the legal reforms of 1864, and which Dostoevsky criticized in his journalism for distracting from the true purpose of the law, to discover the truth. A graduate from the prestigious Imperial School of Jurisprudence, which produced an unusual quantity of eminent writers as well as lawyers, Porfiry imbues his words with Gogolian slipperiness. The saturation of Russian society in texts, furthermore, not only relates to modern secular literature. Sonia used to meet with one of Raskolnikov's victims to read from the Bible together, and later she will read out a passage to the murderer himself about the raising of Lazarus. Indeed, in Crime and Punishment, all believers are fervent readers. Mikolka, the country lad who first confesses to Raskolnikov's crime, kept reading the old, true books and read himself silly. The fact that Mikolka is introduced by Porfiry to Raskolnikov as a Raskolnik, an adherent of the old belief which broke off from the official Orthodox Church in the 17th century, marks him out as one of the protagonist's many alter egos in the novel, just as his reading habits suggest that Raskolnikov, too, read himself silly. This connection is further enriched if we bear in mind that the Raskolniki were a prime target of the propaganda envisioned by the proto-communist revolutionary faction into which Dostoevsky himself was drawn in the late 1840s. The revolution this secret society had in mind was decidedly textual. With the aid of an illegal hand press, assembled shortly before the arrest of the participants in the group, they set about composing revolutionary texts in the language and stylistic register, including the use of Old Church Slavonic, that serfs, and particularly perhaps the Raskolniki, would understand. As Porfiry goes on to say, however, "Mikolka's not our man. What we've got here, sir, is a fantastical, dark deed, a modern deed, a deed of our time when the heart of man has clouded over, when there's talk of renewal through bloodshed, when people preach about anything and everything from a position of comfort. What we have here are bookish dreams, sir, a heart stirred up by theories." The investigation leads, as the reader knows from the start, straight back to Raskolnikov, the modern man, who stands, from our 21st century perspective, like a bridge between the advent of Russian Christianity 1,000 years before, bringing with it books and an alphabet, and the no less literary zeal of Russian communism. Bookish dreams bore terrible fruit in Soviet Russia, whose leaders, Lenin, Stalin, Brezhnev, doubled as prolific authors and fastidious literary critics, and whose drastic changes in policy could be justified by reference to one or another line in one or another of the great books in the Chernyshevskyan Marxist-Leninist canon. As the one-time Bolshevik Victor Serge wrote in Moscow in 1933, no real intellectual inquiry is permitted in any sphere. Everything is reduced to a casuistry nourished on quotations. Demons is usually seen as Dostoevsky's great prophetic novel, but Crime and Punishment, written half a dozen years earlier, is no less so. Analyzing the sealed space of Raskolnikov's mind, Dostoevsky shows how theory estranges life, and casuistry wisdom, how reality becomes a game, at once trivial and fatal in the mind of the reader, writer, artist, the domain of a self-appointed king. In this space, the invisible links that hold both the individual psyche and communal life in some sort of balance dissolve. Not just the arguably relative notions of good and evil, but more seemingly fixed dichotomies collapse. Here, mere words become murderous deeds, almost without the thinker's awareness. An aesthete becomes a louse, subject becomes object. "It was myself I killed," Raskolnikov later reflects. His murders are at once a suicide, his crime is his punishment. The word Raskolnikov may suggest schism, Raskol, But the point about his modernity, his novelty, is not that he is divided. In Dostoevsky's world, everyone is divided, but that he divides himself, taking an axe to his own humanity. And yet, although he commits suicide of the spirit, Raskolnikov does not commit suicide of the body. Like Lazarus, he is given, or does he find, new life. In a characteristic move that would be repeated in the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky argues against his novel's own pessimism, writing a book against bookishness and setting living life against the coffin life of Raskolnikov. This second narrative is the novel that eventually grew from the story pitched to Katkov. It is a journey that will be negotiated not through texts, but through people. The same people whose company Raskolnikov wants to avoid from the opening page. In them, opposites do not collapse, but are held in tension, as the novel's gallery of physical and psychological portraits, riven with contradiction, often attests. In these encounters, the worlds of theory and life finally intersect, and their meeting place is the workshop of human intentions. Dostoevsky, indeed, is the great novelist of intentions. His characters are always defined, to an unusual degree, by the futures that they, like authors, construct for themselves, whether secretly or in public, and which, like Don Quixote, they try to coax into being through language. Now on his second journey, Raskolnikov is brought face to face with the intentions, good, evil, or confused, of other living beings, who represent not so much doubles for him, as is so often stated, but possibilities, different paths between which he must choose. It is at this intersection that the universal aspect of Raskolnikov's fate emerges most forcefully, for it is only among people that his analysis of his own fateful intentions attains a degree of clarity and honesty. He tells Sonia, "Try to understand. Taking that same road again, I might never have repeated the murder. There was something else I needed to find out then. Something else was nudging me along. What I needed to find out, and find out quickly, was whether I was a louse, like everyone else, or a human being. Could I take that step, or couldn't I? Would I dare?" To the end, Raskolnikov's satanic pride remains with him, but the reader can strip away the rhetoric and see that his fundamental motivation may have been little more than that of a child all along. Could he dare? As Raskolnikov himself is painfully aware, this would make a mockery of any claims to lofty morality. But it also renders his story universal, a story of the passage from childhood to maturity. Etymologically, a crime in Russian is a stepping over, prestuplenia, a transgression. To feel alive and free, every person must step over their conscience and the limits imposed on them by themselves and by others. In this sense, everyone has their crime to commit, or, as a certain cynic tells Raskolnikov, everyone has their steps to take. Punishment, too, can be measured in steps, all the way to Siberia, but it must be imposed by another to be meaningful. Here, as throughout the novel, themes, motifs, and verbal echoes, whether to do with walking, with air, or fire, coincide with exceptional force and complexity. It is at this intersection, too, that autobiographical undercurrents can, if we so wish, be identified. If all people are determined by their plans for the future, then how did Dostoevsky's own theoretical plans as a youthful revolutionary differ from Raskolnikov's? Were not the criminal intentions to overthrow the existing state order in Russia with which he and his associates were charged, not without foundation, potentially even more murderous than the realized intentions of Raskolnikov? Speculation, however, is all we have. The elusiveness that Dostoevsky cultivated in his fiction was replicated in his life and literary persona. He left no private diaries, no memoirs, no autobiography. Instead, he gave us a very public diary of a writer, in which he appears before his readers wearing a variety of masks, notably that of the paradoxalist. Letters, in which he frequently declares the impossibility of expressing his true self. His correspondence with his brother Mikhail is an important exception. And notebooks, in which his plots branch off along endless alternative paths. The author's inner life, meanwhile, largely escapes us. We know the facts, but not the person. And this is in tune with Dostoevsky's own lifelong polemic with modernity's exaggeration of the value of mere data. Whatever key fact we take from his life proves, as Porphyry likes to say, double-edged in its potential meaning. Even the meaning of Dostoevsky's suffering eludes us. We might say that the sadistic charade before the firing squad on Semyonovskaya Square traumatized the author for life, or we might say with William Empson that it was a reprieve made Dostoevsky talk out queer and clear. We might say that 4 years of forced labor in Siberia left him old before his time and disabused him about human nature. Or we might say that it saved him as a writer and a man, removing him from the hothouse of Saint Petersburg Literary Society, in which he was wilting and supplying him with a newfound maturity, as well as the trove of fresh material, linguistic and human, that he acquired by observing his fellow common convicts, much of which resurfaces in the present novel. We can argue that his frequent and violent attacks of epilepsy were a curse, inflicting terror, near madness and pain, or we can argue, following the late J.L. Rice, that they were a creative tonic. It is apt that some of the most interesting recent books on Dostoevsky have been works of fiction. The master, one suspects, might well have approved of J.M. Coetzee's Master of Petersburg, 1994, in which an invented plot sets off a compelling portrait of Dostoevsky surrounded and oppressed by the atmosphere of his own novels. He himself needed invention as a path to understanding. Indeed, he appeared to need it to the same extent that his great rival, Tolstoy, whose War and Peace, 1865-69, was published at the same time as Crime and Punishment and in the very same journal, grew to abhor it. The two works meet in the dethronement of the great man theory of history, the Napoleon complex, but have little else in common. Tolstoy needed certainty and truth. Dostoevsky required lies, that vibrant stream of invention in relation to the past, present, and future, that, as channeled through the rogue Masloboyev in The Insulted and Injured, 1861, makes even his weakest novel memorable. Perhaps, like Razumikhin, Dostoevsky thought that fibbing would bring him to the truth, or at least to a more complete picture of the truth than that provided by his tendentious writing in non-fictional genres. Certainly in the much-disputed epilogue to Crime and Punishment, the truth remains elusive. Some will conclude that Raskolnikov rediscovers himself in his rediscovery of his native land and native people. Others will cite his own astonishment at the dreadful unbridgeable gulf that lay between him and all these commoners, and his own enduring confusion about his crime. Some, following one of Dostoevsky's sharpest critics and biographers, Konstantin Mochulsky, have read the epilogue as a pious lie, an unconvincing conversion to Christianity. Others remain unpersuaded that any conversion takes place at all. What is beyond dispute is that these final pages, filled with a restrained joy, show Dostoevsky at his most tender and his writing at its most delicate. Here, one would like to think, the autobiographical subtext is far from arbitrary. For as he wrote these pages, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky was himself setting out on a new path, taking with him a new wife, his stenographer, Anna Grigoryevna, and, no doubt, the very best intentions.